is History Net with Mr. Brass, interviewing casual historian, also known as Grant Hurst. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing all right.
This is History Net with Mr. Brass, interviewing. Tell us about yourself and your channel, also known as Grant.
Okay, hold on. Sorry. Okay, could you repeat that?
Tell us about yourself and your channel. Got an echo there.
All right. So, of course, my name's Grant. I do history videos. That's the simplest version of it, but I like to do a lot of intellectual history. That's why a lot of my videos end up covering political science, religious ideas, and intellectual histories, especially the more out there ones. I got my bachelor's last year, and so from that point on, I've essentially been a independent, for lack of better words, pop historian, since I'm not working within academia, and I'm just doing it all here on YouTube.
Great. Now all you need to do is get a PhD and simply sell very cringe books, and you can be the next Richard Carrier.
Yeah.
I always found history interesting myself and excelled at it in school, but like they haven't really taught us much about history outside the Civil War and World War II, and occasionally stuff like the Crusades and the Renaissance. And since I'm a gamer, what really got me into history was Metal Gear Solid 3 and Assassin's Creed. I know, right? The subject endlessly fascinated me from there. Like, what got you into history?
Well, I really liked map-based games when I was younger. So I played a lot of Risk when I was younger, and then a little older, I started playing Axis and Allies. And then you get bored with the regular map, so you try making your own, because, you know, you can only play the same 6 continents, and he who controls Australia controls the world so many times.
I know.
Like, what got you into history?
Oh, sorry. I was saying, I know what got me into history was in the 3rd grade, I picked up a biography on Martin Luther King Jr., and I read it and I became fascinated, and from there, I started just loving history. I started off just with knowing some famous black, some famous black African American people. So, you know, it kind of went from there, and gradually I went on to more religious topics, such as the Crusades, the Inquisition. I'm planning on going into the Enlightenment someday, but yeah.
What would be your favorite periods in history? Like, mine would have to be ancient Egypt, the Old Testament, Roman Empire, medieval Europe, the Renaissance, feudal Japan, the Wild West, and the 20th century.
Let's see. Well, I guess favorite period to study, I'm a big fan of studying the modern Middle East, because it's just a big part of where we are now, is the mess that went on there. But American Revolution was an era I was really into for a long time. Basically, 19th century was my bread and butter for the longest time. So, you know, age of imperialism, age of expansion.
What makes it your favorite?
I guess the 19th century kind of feels like a transitionary time period where it's not quite the modern world, but it's not quite the older medieval world. It's this. I guess the transitionary periods are always the ones I find most fascinating. It's not quite like the next point. It's not quite the previous. And the 19th century has all these ideas. It's where we get the rise of the modern nation state, the rise of imperialism, the rise of international capitalism, the creation of communism, the creation of all these different ideas that make the world we live in today. And that atmosphere just all collided together by the end of it to create the giant mess the 20th century was.
Yeah. Yeah, the 19th century was, when people say that, they usually get the idea of the Civil War and the Wild West in their heads, but a lot else went on in that era, like the like Victorian England, the Victorian era, the Meiji Restoration in Japan, the British Raj in India.
Yep, it created the modern world, and that's why it was one of my favorite periods to study, other than perhaps the modern Middle East.
Well, I mean, also what's funny is like people get this idea that there was so much death in the like the Wild West, but they've actually done some like studies on that, and they found like when you really average out the numbers, the number of even gun violences is lower than New York or Chicago.
Yeah, but that seems to come with the territory of there just being a lot fewer people there also. I mean, you could be the only person for 100 miles. It's not nowhere near impossible back then.
Well, I mean, even like you think of the most violent gunfight back then was the battle at the OK Corral,
Yeah.
and really like that was a battle that where only like what 3-4 people died.
Yeah, and you also have the expanded legends of these outlaws. Like Billy the Kid, turns out even his kill list in legend wasn't that much compared to what might have been. It turns out he only killed like several people.
Yeah, well,
And you ever notice the Wild West looks primitive compared to most any other era before it? I always found that interesting.
that's the general look of frontier type eras in history. It's
Yeah.
Another area I got into was reading about like have you got into reading like anything on Christopher Columbus?
I am not a Columbus man myself. He is just a nice hot mess.
Yeah,
And,
depending on the person you talk to, he's either this great daring explorer that changed the world or the worst of scoundrels.
I like to prefer both.
yeah, the the only thing on Columbus I take a stand on is that his discovery of the Americas actually mattered, unlike those people who want to talk about Vikings. It's like, good for them. I don't see Indo-Viking civilization. Or
like quote unquote discovered, because he actually bumped into it and to his dying day thought he landed in India.
Oh yeah.
Then
Well, I mean, yeah, and it's funny because we still call Native Americans Indians, even though that was a complete mistake on Columbus's part.
hey, I embrace that term. It has a better ring to it. Then you got all these different, like starting with after the Renaissance eras in history, where starting the gaps in these time periods started getting smaller and smaller. Whereas before that, like ancient Egypt and the Roman Empire, medieval Europe lasted centuries at a time. Then you get to the 20th century, where each decade was its own era. Seems like.
Yeah, it reminds me of a concept from, I think it's a book published back in the 1980s, Cleon Skousen's 5,000 Year Leap. He presents this idea of sort of like starting with Columbus's discovery of the Americas, just everything progresses just far faster. It's like we've made more progress in terms of technology, economy, and everything else in the last 500 years than humankind had done in the previous 5,000.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it? Also, I mean, you have to remember, we progressed so much. Like, think about it. We used to just be a tribe of people that killed each other with rocks and spears for no good reason. Now we upgraded. Now we kill entire cities of people with bombs, guns, and everything for no good reason. So, hey, we progressed.
Not much changed. But a lot did change, but a lot didn't, mostly.
Well, I like to go with how John Gray, who's a philosopher, he says, is just monkeys got some new toys to play with.
Indeed.
But yeah, a question I think I would ask is like, I believe you said you got a bachelor's. is that as far as you want to take your academia career, or do you want to go like higher, like to a master's or PhD even?
I would like to eventually get a graduate degree, a master's, a PhD eventually at some point. But for the time being, I'm going to spend a little time living life a little bit and paying down debts before I decide to go back to try and do grad school.
Seems fair. Yeah, I remember it is getting pretty hard for men, especially in colleges, because they tend to be very women-centered. So I think it is going to, I don't know if that's the same in history or not. I think it might not be, um, but yeah, I do think you said you also got into you said you delve into politics. What do you like? What's the political party you really go for? Like your political philosophy?
Well, I am a registered Republican here in the People's Republic of California, but
California.
yeah, well, you know, they wanted to secede, so well at the last election, but anyways, I have not been a big fan of the Republican Party as it has been since I became a registered voter back in 2008. I haven't voted for one presidential candidate the party has nominated since then. So that's 2008, 12, 16. So yeah, no, I didn't vote for McCain, Romney, or Trump simply because I thought none of them were conservative enough. They didn't feel like they were actual conservatives. They're just, I mean, who knows what the hell Trump is?
Well, I mean, you have to remember, man, he grew up in Brooklyn and he was only given a small loan of $1 million. That's barely enough to pay rent for an apartment in New York.
And according to certain deluded fundagelicals, he's God's champion, his instrument, or some other shit.
Well, I know Michelle. I know Michelle Bachmann said that he was the most biblical president they've ever had.
He's more like the least biblical.
God, like I hate all the comparisons they tried to make with him and like King David. Like he's this imperfect ruler, but we need him. He's strong.
It's I know, like David was an asshole, but so is this guy.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Trump has slept with a man's wife and then sent that man off to die in a war, but
well, if he hasn't, he'll probably end up doing that sometime in his presidency.
I heard some college professor say that his rise is similar to that of Hitler.
Although it's actually pretty funny if you actually look at how the Democratic Party actually supports everything Hitler pretty much would have loved.
Yeah, well, the comparing, of course, any president to Hitler is always fraught with incorrections. Like every election, if it doesn't turn out your way, you always hear well, you know, Hitler was elected, so democracy is not all that great, which you heard after Trump got elected. And it's like, okay, first of all, that's just not accurate. Hitler wasn't elected. He was appointed because he abused parliamentary procedure in the Weimar Republic to the point where the Hindenburg and the conservatives were forced to either, okay, yeah, you want to form a government? You have to pick the Nazis or the communists. You know what the communists can do. You saw what they did in Russia. You don't know what the Nazis are capable of. And so left him with no choice abusing parliamentary procedure.
Well, it wasn't that long ago that people were calling Obama the Antichrist. For some reason, I never saw any indication.
Yeah, like there was that on History Channel. They had that series, the Bible series, like back in 2013, and they had that scene with Lucifer, but he looks suspiciously like Obama.
Yeah, that also is a pet peeve of mine. The whitewashing is just unnecessary. Like back in the 50s when you had the Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur, like that was understandable, like whitewashing back then. But now it's just uncalled for. They need Middle Eastern actors to fill in the roles more. Like it's like having American Revolution with black people as the presidents and stuff like that.
Yeah, I can see that. I think it's pretty just interesting. So, I believe I would take it that since you're into religious stuff, I would say that, are you particularly religious?
Yes, I am. I have been unfortunately not the best church goer in the last number of years, but I have definitely spent far more time studying my religion in those same years. So I am a Lutheran of the Missouri Synod denomination here in the U.S. And those of you who might not know, there's 3 major Lutheran denominations in the U.S. There's one that's really liberal. That's the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, which most people get surprised when they hear the evangelicals are liberal in this case. Then you have 2 conservative denominations. The Missouri Synod, the one I'm in, is more center-right. And then you have the super further to the right one, the Wisconsin Evangelical Synod. Yeah, like the difference, like the Evangelical Lutheran Church, they ordain women as ministers, give baptism to animals, and all sorts of out there stuff.
Yeah, like what do you make of the historical studies surrounding the Old and New Testaments? Like there's a prevailing view in scholarship that seems to indicate that most of the Old Testament, like before the time of King David, was a pseudo-historical recreation of what really happened.
Well, the problem with it is that there's not a whole lot of material evidence to support much of what comes in the like in the 5 books of Moses. Unfortunately, there's just not a whole lot there. And the most scholars really on either side can do, especially with the archaeological evidence, is calculate probability of what are the chances that this could be X, Y, or Z. And like, unfortunately, like you hear some of the numbers given in the Old Testament, like for the story of Exodus, saying that 600,000 men left on foot from Egypt.
Yeah, that's impossible.
Yeah, it's like 600,000 men. And once again, that's just the men. That's not including the women and the children. So if you assume, if you assume that the number is probably quadruple that if you're assuming women and children there as well, that's 2.5 million people. That would have been just about the population of late Bronze Age Egypt.
Yeah, you got that many people in one town. They're not slaves. They're there by a choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I remember I was hearing one atheist named Aaron Ra who said, like, if you have all those millions of people like as slaves, couldn't they just overthrow? Like, they would just overthrow the city. I said, you do realize in ancient Greek for a long time there was more slaves than there were free people.
Yeah, he knows jack about history himself, but
you could say the same thing about 19th century South Carolina.
But there's like my position on the Exodus is that something happened, kind of like the Trojan War. It was exaggerated a bit for like literary genre purposes. That's another thing they take into consideration with Old Testament studies is genre. Like it's not all history, it's not all religion, like not all philosophy and poetry and yeah.
Well, I mean, of course something happened. A bunch of Bronze Age goat herders came together to write a fairy tale.
Yeah. One of the big problems I have with this idea that like you hear a good number saying it's supposed to be, it was a fiction meant to be sort of an allegory for their exile in Babylon, which is when most of the books of Moses were first written down. And this concept that it was just supposed to be a story to lift spirits doesn't really mesh with how everyone afterwards treated it. Like Josephus definitely saw it as actual history. In the New Testament, it's definitely treated seriously as an actual event. It's not like only 500 years after it happens, after it was supposedly written, people know or think of it as actual history.
Yeah, and not the whole Torah was written during the exile. Like there are two different traditions: the J and E source from the south of Judah and the north of Israel, respectively. Like the J and E source, they had the stories of Exodus and Numbers and good chunk of Genesis for each one. Then they were stitched together during the exile in Babylon by the priestly writer who himself wrote the book of Leviticus. And the D source, Deuteronomy, was written during the time of Josiah.
Yeah, that's a lot of stuff I'm getting into with my History of the Jews series. But that's neither here nor there.
Right.
Well, I mean, I always find it funny when you actually look at the history of Christianity and their relationship with Jews. It's sort of a mixed bag. It said, well, which time frame do you really want to go into?
Yeah.
If you want to go into the Middle Ages, it really probably the best place to be a Jew in the Middle Ages was for a long time it was Spain. Well, no, until even for example, when the Spanish Inquisition happened, the King Ferdinand made sure to tell them, like, when he was expelling them from Spain, he made sure to tell them that it was nothing against them personally as Jews, but it was just that he had to separate them from the conversos.
Yeah, and during the Renaissance, they were putting ghettos in Venice, in Italy.
Yeah, let's just say there's not many places in the world that you'd want to be a Jew until maybe the last century.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, everyone hates Jews. Even Jews hate Jews.
The Jews own Hollywood,
Yes, those are the people who pay me for all of my Israel propaganda.
Right.
So are you, I'm trying to think, are you a Zionist?
Well, Lutherans don't really tend to be big supporters of the state of Israel, or at least we're not supporters of the state of Israel in the sense of like you might find a Baptist or fundamentalist Protestant evangelicals down in the South. It's more of an individual thing. I personally support the existence of Israel, but mostly because it's the only place in the region that actually protects human rights to any significant degree. So if I had to live anywhere in the region, it would be in Israel.
Like Jerusalem in particular, or the Tel Aviv, which looks a lot like the city where I live.
Well, I haven't been to either. I love to visit both, but Israel does have a special presence, and even though we Lutherans don't put a big, much cachet in the concept of pilgrimages, it's still a place that'd be neat to visit.
Absolutely. The land of milk
I
and honey.
remember how you said you're a Lutheran, and I think that is pretty interesting, because I remember one little thing I tend to get from Protestants where they say what Luther did, like when he was hanging his 95 Theses, like when he was nailing his 95 Theses to the church door, they were saying, look how brave he was. He took so much great risk and was doing such different than everybody else was doing back in his time. I said, no. He was a professor. They all did that. And people would have just taken his 95 Theses, which, if you actually trace them back, almost all the complaints go even before he was born to, I think, Erasmus. And so, yeah, a lot of the critics, it would have all been taken as just points of debate. And it was just funny. I said, I mean, what got Luther off the ground was the printing press. That was what did it. And the fact that the Catholics actually didn't try to learn how to use the printing press really well.
A lot of their first propaganda, the printing press, was to vilify Vlad the Impaler.
Yeah, well, for Luther, most of his arguments around for in the 95 Theses weren't actually original to him. I mean, what really needs to be understood is that he really was influenced by the time he was in. You have the Hussites from a century earlier who he got influences from, and the biggest influence on him would have to have been the Augustinians. You know, he was an Augustinian monk, and Augustine was talking about this idea of, you know, like man is too sinful to work toward salvation. You know, it's like he needs, you know, the grace of God to be saved. That's an Augustinian idea, you know, early church fathers stuff. And so those are the ideas that the Augustinian monks and the Augustinian orders were based on. And so Luther was really just coming out of a Catholic tradition. And also there's the whole idea of, you know, how he translated part of the Bible to saying, you know, in like faith alone, when in reality, how you'll hear Catholics nowadays saying, you know, oh, well, he changed it. It just says, you know, by faith, ignoring the fact that faith alone, Luther's Bible was not the first one to translate that passage as faith alone. In fact, there were Bibles in circulation approved by the Catholic Church at that time that said faith alone.
Think how different history might have been if Luther had been Pope and Leo had been that reader in a German university.
Well, if Luther had become Pope, he would have been a bit later, but that's a weird, another alternate timeline with a Saint Luther, and I don't want to get into that. Luther would not call himself a saint. A bit too scatological.
Well, I mean, you have to remember, man, he invented anti-Semitism and was very, you know, he very much hated Jews and stuff.
Oh, and yeah, and Hitler took after him, even though he was the poster boy for Protestantism, and Hitler was supposedly a Catholic.
Yeah. Well, I'm not to sound like a hipster, but I prefer his earlier work. Like, anyways, like, I guess to understand, like, the big one people think of for his anti-Semitism, you know, the Jews and their lies. Yeah. That tome. Lutherans sort of have a separation. Like, we hold like a lot of his writings to be theologically authoritative, but they have to be his theological writings, as in those are authoritative. But the Jews and their lies wasn't a theological document. That was political. It was polemical. Because of that, we don't hold it to hold any theological weight.
Well, I mean, also you have to kind of consider the fact that, like, for one, anti-Semitism was present even before he was born, where he was at. Yeah. So he sort of just grew into it.
Yeah, he also believed in fairies.
Oh yeah, but who doesn't?
And endured around 10 kidney stones. You can imagine why he was angry all the time.
Also, all the scatological humor. He just loved his poop jokes.
Yeah,
I mean, you also have to remember, man, that he called reason a whore, and you know he completely denounced reason in order for faith, i.e., belief without evidence.
And there's also another character, Calvin, who advocated the burning of witches.
Calvin's what you get when you let a French lawyer write your theology.
Basically.
Instead of a German law school dropout who became a monk write your theology. It's completely different.
That we have no free will and predetermination and all that shit.
Well, to be quite fair, that wasn't even original to Calvin. I mean, yeah. Augustine was a compatibilist, really, you could say.
Oh yeah, he was a Calvinist, apparently.
Well, I mean, it's not that difficult. Like, if you read, it depends on when you're reading Augustine, because his views on free will sort of varied throughout his life. So, I mean, in some you can find where he was like a determinist, and on others where he's more like a compatibilist. He sort of went back and forth.
You sort of sighed when I mentioned Calvin. Tells more.
Ooh, Calvin is what I find is everything wrong with Protestant Christianity came from Calvin, or started with Calvin. It's like all the ideas about Christianity, the things people hate the most usually come from the Calvinist tradition. that being, the much of the fire and brimstone type stuff that we're used to came from Calvin, or the reprobate idea, this double predestination, which is biblically speaking nonsense. Luther's perspective on the idea of the elect and whatnot is the usually talked about single predestination, which is some people are predestined. Some people are predestined to salvation, and then everyone else we don't know because the Bible doesn't say.
Yeah, so, they just point to certain Bible verses that talk about the elected.
Yeah, and so the problem with Calvin is that, I think this comes from John Calvin's lawyer background, is that he makes this assumption that, well, the Bible talks about some people who are elect and are therefore saved. Everyone else must not be saved by the only logic he can think of. So it's like, well, if you're not elect, then you must be reprobate. Even though the Bible doesn't actually say what happens to the non-elect.
Yeah. Like, well, while we're speaking of the Old and New Testament earlier, I noticed you did a series. I first noticed you when you did your series on the Christ myth theory, just like young Earth creationism and the flat Earth movement. It unfortunately persists like a plague. It has no impact on academic circles, but it has been blindly accepted by a good chunk of militant atheists who don't have a clue about how history works, among other bad history they propagate.
Yeah. There actually is a part of the world where mythicism is taking root in academic circles, and in some cases even within relevant academic circles, and that would be Scandinavia.
Yeah. How do they know, right?
Well, I mean, you have to remember, man, Scandinavia is a secular paradise. With it's a secular paradise where atheists, with all atheists, and it's just unicorns and rainbows there.
There's such peace and harmony, don't they?
Sweden's a fun mess. Sweden, until the year 2000, the national church was the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Sweden was their national church until about the year 2000, and about 87% of the population of Sweden are members of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Sweden, but 90% of the Sweden's population are self-professed atheists.
But even if it were an atheist country, they fail to forget about Switzerland and Austria are both religious countries, and they're doing well off more than all these Scandinavian countries combined.
Yeah, well, you got the Swiss and their secret Nazi gold, or whatever people are calling it now.
Switzerland Nazi gold. Or Austrian Nazi gold.
I think the Austrians were more into the art.
And along with being a history buff, I'm a fanatical movie buff as well as a gamer. Of course, this would make historical epics one of my favorite genres. What would be your favorite and why?
Boy. The weird thing is that I don't watch too many full-length movies anymore. It's basically unless it has Marvel stuff in it, I don't go to the theaters much anymore. So the big movies I usually liked were, once upon a time, of course, the Lord of the Rings. Those were my favorite for a very long time. I'm those. I
meant historical epics, not fantasy epics.
Yes, I'd say that's kind of what I'm saying. I'm not the hugest fan of historical epics or historical fiction or things like that. I watch them, but I just don't do that very often. I think the last one I saw may have been The Imitation Game, I think.
The Game of Thrones takes elements from medieval history, like the War of the Roses.
Yeah.
I mean, here's what's funny as hell about Game of Thrones doesn't even make sense for its history if you actually look at it, because since the author is an atheist, basically the entire thing is littered with atheist jokes. I'm saying, how many atheists would be in the Middle Ages?
I thought he was agnostic.
Oh no, he's an atheist.
Huh.
He's actually even a militant atheist because he basically said, "I don't know how any intelligent person can be a theist."
Huh.
Well, I mean, he fits the typical thing of an atheist. He's a he's a fat neckbeard, so yeah, he just needs a fedora.
Remember,
But yeah,
Huh?
I just remember it's so funny because like it's for one, it's littered with a bunch of homosexual scenes as well because got to go for that shock humor.
well, the sex
And the
humor, there's some. No, I mean there's like sex scenes in like every episode, right?
Yeah, and like he basically any type of sex that you could think about, they have it. Whether it be incest,
Yeah.
it'd be homosexual sex, bisexual sex. They pretty much go all out. I was like, this would not work in the medieval times. They would have them all killed.
Well,
It's a bad-
in the Middle Ages, the royals and the nobles could get away with a lot more than the average person could. Like it is said, like when King James the First of England / 6th of Scotland came to London, he had his boyfriend around one arm and his wife in the carriage behind. It's like royals they lived by a different standard than the rest of society. I mean,
So not much has changed.
No,
Yeah.
a lot of. I get the feeling that a lot of anti-theists today watch too much *Handmaid's Tale*.
oh God.
About what a
Yeah.
future would look like if it was dominated by evangelical fundamentalist Christianity.
So I haven't seen the show, but I read the book back in community college. I had I read it for an English class. The professor was obsessed with feminist writings from the 70s and 80s. And so the whole time we were just reading stuff like outdated complaints about gender norms. It's like, I would love to have a wife. I'd love to have someone to do all the work around the house. It's like, this person's writing to a completely different time period. I grew up in the 90s. My parents split housework pretty evenly. It's not.
God,
Yeah.
I miss that decade. But yeah, that book came out in the '80s, and
Yeah, it's like here's the thing. The book, the story nowadays gets praised for its storytelling, but until the Hulu show came out, no one praised the show for its storytelling because the book is god awful. It is a jumbled mess. It's not chronological, and it's the idea of it's a collection of lost diary entries that we've assembled together, and the story is actually being told in a history class 200 years later after this civil war. And it's like, historians would have put this together in proper chronological order, right? That's one of the things they do.
yeah,
Well, I also
the show seems to embody all the fears that the new atheists have against religious people.
Mhm.
What were you going to say, Bryce?
Yeah, I also remember I was just recently thinking about that, about how it would be like 2.2 million people in like that coming out of Egypt. Another thing like people forget to realize is that this is an honor culture. So we all tend to know that like even in ancient Greece that you could see this where they made the numbers huge because for one if they won like they would make it seem huger for the enemies so they could gain honor saying, hey, look, we conquered these guys with this large army. It's like, for example, the movie 300?
Yeah.
You mean that documentary?
Well-
Yes.
Well, yeah, so, I mean, they say 300 Spartan as if that's the only people that were there. I was like, yeah, it was 300 Spartans and like what, maybe like 1,000 or so other people from the from the Spartan nations.
And they idealize these colossal assholes.
And I mean, another funny thing is like none of them wear armor. I'm like, just so they can have an excuse to just show them all with their abs.
Beefcake muscles.
In defense of the film, it's of course being based on the graphic novel, not the historical event.
Yeah, it's from the perspective of one of them telling the story, so you can understand why it's filled with beasts and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, another funny thing that people wouldn't have taken into account is that Leonidas at the time of that war was like in his 40s to 50s.
Yeah, and I liked Troy also. They tried telling it without they stripped it from the god stuff, and they mixed around the stories. Like certain people who died in the Iliad didn't die on the movie, and it was more mishmashed.
I mean, what I like about it is like people get mad when they change a stuff from a book. Like you have a popular book, and when you get a movie that even changes it a little bit, people get mad. I'm saying you have to change it a little bit, because if you made it exactly the same, why would you read the book? And why would you even see the movie? Because you could predict it easily.
Yeah, but Troy was really good though.
Oh yeah, I liked it. It was a good movie. I'm just saying, I just have my little critique. I was like, I think what people should aspire to do is like, if you're going to make an adaptation of a book, you should just see like what are things that people hate about the book, and simply change those or remove those parts depending, and keep the good parts.
Like I always watch it after I watch the Ten Commandments, because if you're going for the late date, which I don't go for, it would have taken place around that time.
See, I would say a much better rendition of that story would probably be, in my opinion at least, it's always Prince of Egypt is always the best rendition of the
that's also a classic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you look at DreamWorks' filmography, and it's like peaking a little early there, ain't we?
Yeah, around with just instead of Ramesses II, just picture Amenhotep II or Tutmosis III in its place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love that movie along with Hercules that came out like a year earlier. Disney's Hercules.
Mm-hmm.
I remember also what was funny is on Atheist Republic, they sort of know me well there, but yeah, it was funny that what happened is that they did this sort of meme with Moses, and they said, well, I was herding goats for a while, so now I better be telling everyone else about the universe and how everything works. I'm like, you do realize that since Moses was raised into royalty, he would have been educated.
You know what else is funny? They say a lot of them say with confidence that Moses never existed. Certainly because scholars say there's no, like, that's not the consensus. The consensus is that there's no way to archaeologically verify his existence anyway. Like, how often do we find these great statues and monuments to desert nomad leaders?
Yeah, not often. Built a lot later if we do.
And he most certainly wouldn't have looked like a white guy with a beard.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, going on. Huh?
Oh, so yeah. I think it is. I think the whole thing with Moses is pretty good. I'm sort of like, I lean on more on he didn't exist, but I'm willing to concede that maybe there was like
historical memory.
Yeah, I think what happened is that there was an idea, like Moses was an idealistic character, where Moses wasn't just one person. It was they took all the elements that they admired about their leaders and put them into one character and called it Moses, which would explain why, when you go into the commentaries on the Old Testament, the early ones, they all have Moses under different names. So, yeah, it could make sense. Like what they were doing really is that they were just taking a bunch of the leaders that they had at the time and they just took all the attributes they liked and they felt were human and just put them into one character.
Like on the central template being the guy Moses himself, who probably had an Egyptian name like Ra Moses or something like that, and they took that out because that was like having an Egyptian name was kind of embarrassing for them. Like not like King Arthur, who is clearly pastiche of various other leaders, like that what's his face? I can't remember his name. He's often called the last of the Romans. He lived around the time of the fall of the Roman Empire and lived in Britain. Also with Alfred the Great and Charlemagne.
I just keep thinking Gildas, but that's just the guy who wrote it down. But yeah, I can't think of the guy's name. They tried to do that version in the 2004 Arthur movie, I think.
Oh yeah, that one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the marketing campaign said it was going to be so historically accurate, and turns out just about everything was wrong with it.
I mean, there is some things I can sort of let a movie get away with when they're doing history, because like sometimes it's funny. I'll watch a Western movie that claims to be historically accurate, and the guns that they all use are way too modern for in the Western times that they would have been living in. I was thinking, like, I could let that slide because, for like entertainment purposes. It just, when it gets more than that, that's when I sort of draw the line.
There's a certain branch of Christ-smithers who also say the same about Jesus, that he was an amalgamation of other prophets and figures. Like, that's not what the evidence indicates.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, here's what's funny. They seem to take it as so obvious that it's the case, but they never actually provide any evidence for why that is the case.
Well, one guy tried to make a case he's a nutty Christ-smither that writes a blog, but he claims that he was a composite of Theudas and the Egyptian prophet and Jesus ben Ananias.
Don't know if I know that one at the top of my head.
Jesus ben Damnius, that's it. He's normally the one they try to claim that Josephus talked about.
Oh god, those ones, yeah. I remember it's a year or two ago now. Did that movie of Batman and Jesus ever get made? I remember seeing the trailer.
I don't know. I haven't seen.
I remember. I know what you're talking about. I remember Aaron Raw endorsed it.
Mm-hmm.
So Batman and Jesus. To be fair, if you have Michael Bay running it, I'll watch that thing all the time because you'll end up getting Megan Fox's Mary Magdalene.
No, it's supposed to be a documentary comparing the two. I never liked that asinine comparison between Jesus, and other superheroes like Spider-Man and Superman. We know for a fact that they are fictional. We know who created them and why. We don't have any of that for Jesus because it's the consensus that the Gospels are in the genre of Greco-Roman biography.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
What were you going to say?
I lost my train of thought, but yeah, the idea that 2,000 years from now we would treat Batman the way we treat Jesus or something like that. Yeah,
and Spider-Man in New York, if they were to find archaeological records, it's just such horseshit. Also with Harry Potter, they love that one. Oh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so yeah, the trailer for Batman and Jesus at least looked interesting. It's like, okay, I appreciate the production values you did in creating a church that looks like you're worshiping Batman. I appreciate the artistry here, but
actually Futurama did a joke on that with Star Trek that the fan base ended up becoming a full-blown religion. You saw that episode?
Yeah, that's That's Futurama. Like,
I love
can't
that show.
miss it. Well, that's what you get when you have a bunch of mathematicians and nerds writing a show about the future.
Like we'll probably be that advanced, but we'll never be that socially egalitarian. It's just not going to happen given human nature.
Well, I don't know how egalitarian I'd say the Futurama world is. I've always referred to
talking about Star Trek. Like, anyway, what were we saying about Futurama?
saying that I've always referred to Futurama as what you call a meh-topia, like utopia or dystopia. It's a meh-topia. It's more or less just the same, but more fancy.
Yeah.
I mean, we could do Christ mythicism so much better. You know, we'll take Christ mythicism and we'll get some hookers and blackjack.
Yeah, forget the Christ mythicism.
Yeah.
Yeah, just get some blackjack and hookers.
Even Star Wars has its own fan base, has its own mock religion, along with a spaghetti monster and pink unicorn called Jediism.
Well, you know, lightsaber fighting is a thing in France now, apparently. Their fencing league has embraced lightsaber duels.
Well, I mean, at least they're doing something productive.
Well, you know, what's the last thing France contributed to the world? Descartes, I think.
Yeah, I think that is. I mean,
And D'Anton Napoleon.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure what was Voltaire. I think he was. I can't remember what he was.
He was French.
French. Yeah. So-
Napoleon would be their last triumph.
Pretty much. Oh, France and Sweden go to war. Who wins? Neither. They both surrender.
Yeah.
Mm.
Like, okay, questions from, well, Cloud Rider in the comments says, I love Casual Historian's video on Lutheranism in America. He also asks, what's the worst form of pseudo-history that you have read, all of you?
Worst kind of pseudo-history.
Mine would have to be on the Historicity of Jesus by Crackpot Carrier.
See, well, for me, mythicism is annoying, but that's mostly what it is, just annoying. The worst I've had to read was Holocaust deniers, and that's because I made a video about them earlier this year. I had to read so much Holocaust denier stuff and watch so many lectures to find the right footage. It was just awful. They're the worst to read in my book. They are pseudo-historians, and it's a little more dangerous than other pseudo-histories.
Well, yeah, I mean, because they have a lot of political power too. I believe there's a couple of them running for like office in some states.
They haven't done well. The only places where Holocaust deniers have any power is, well, in the Middle East. That's where they have prominence, and that's where they are official policy.
Pretty much.
They're not all that different about it. What would be yours, Brass?
To be quite frank, I mean, to go to mythicism, personally, Joseph Atwill is like, I read some of his work, and like even the premise, like when you read like this, just the basic summary of what it's supposed to be, just that alone got me to facepalm so hard that I think I got a concussion.
It's probably as bad as Freud's book on Moses. Like Moses died, and the Israelites ended up killing Moses, and then they recreated this volcano god out of guilt for killing him or some shit along those lines.
Yeah.
And speaking of bad mythicist material, have you also read what was that? Caesar is Christ by that Italian scholar. Well, he's not really a scholar, but have you read that?
So yeah, I'm familiar with the thesis. I haven't seen that one in particular, but I'm familiar with, I think, the guy he probably got it from, which was Christ and the Caesars by Bruno Bauer. back in the 1870s, he was the first one to bring up that idea, or at least the first one to put it in the word. And so I'm thinking that's where he probably got the idea from.
Well, I mean, just remember, Nazareth didn't exist. It didn't exist. A piano player said so.
We're just gonna ignore that. But speaking about the Roman Empire and what we were talking about earlier about shows and movies, like I like the Hunger Games. That's like post-apocalyptic future after that nuclear war happened, and then America turns into a bunch of districts and provinces, like in post-apocalyptic America. Then the capital ended up being remodeling itself after the Roman Empire.
Yeah, like the political reaction to that movie I always found to be very odd and fascinating, because like you had both like people on the far left and like hardcore libertarians all embracing the movie and its messages, all trying to say, no, this movie supports our political message. But the hardcore environmentalists going, this is what happens when you let capitalism run amok. And libertarians saying, well, look at this society. It's a total, top-down totalitarian.
I'm like, no, it's what happens when you bring back the Roman Empire. Like, I enjoyed it a hell of a lot more than Harry Potter and Twilight.
Well, yeah, and another funny thing is like the Hunger Games in and of itself is based off of the Lazarus. I mean the Minotaur. That's what it is. The Minotaur in the maze.
It's mostly based on the Gladiator games.
I always just I always assumed that it was 21st century battle royale ripoff like all the others.
Yeah, I mean, it was funny because the author actually said she didn't actually know about battle royale until like someone told her about it. I didn't even know about it until like maybe a year after I read the books. So yeah, it sort of took me off too with it. I was trying to think about with the Roman Empire too. We were talking about. I remember they go into the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, like the front, and people always say, well, why did it take so long for Christians to actually make a technological advance? I said, well, forgive them for not advancing technology as far as you want. They sort of had other things to worry about, like rebuilding, their lost empire. Plus, they had to try to keep themselves from being killed by pagan barbarians. So, yeah. Sorry, they weren't able to really to get the technology that you wanted sooner.
I suppose Jesus should have invented the printing press just to impress you. And what's your take on the historical Jesus? Obviously, you're a Christian, but
yeah. Well, pretty straightforward gospel type, historical Jesus. I think he was a man of his time. He was a Jew, messianic prophet, or not messianic prophet, just a messianic preacher who ended up, being the Messiah himself.
Yeah, like, do you believe that he was the incarnated Logos, or did he become such upon his baptism or resurrection?
Well, as a true to form Trinitarian, he was, he was God the entire time, just not the other parts.
I know the view that you're talking about, Ingen. That's called adoptionism.
Yeah, I'm an omnist, and I'm divided on that also.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I remember you were talking about that on Twitter, and I actually looked it up. Yeah, it's adoptionism. It's the idea that basically God, it's a non-Trinitarian view, I think, where basically God anointed and took Jesus in after his baptism.
Yeah, like either way, the resurrection has a relatively decent case for it.
Yeah, I'm a pretty straightforward Trinitarian. He was part of God the entire time. That's kind of the whole deal with having to divinely inseminate Mary, for lack of better terminology.
Yeah. The Catholics, apparently they worship Mary like a goddess.
Lutherans are pretty into her also, but we don't have
the consistent Lutherans anyway, those that appeal to the real Luther sentiments, who he valued her highly.
Yes. We just don't really we tend not to have as many bleeding eye statues as the Catholics do.
Right. they even they deify many of their they didn't deify, they just elevated their certain saints, and even some after pagan deities, rebadged pagan deities, and one of their saints is a dog, even Saint Gwynford.
Well, I mean, we could say dogs are the closest thing to perfection the human world has.
And Cloud Rider asks, is America the new Rome?
I don't know. I never know how to answer this. I made a video about comparing sort of, how people like to compare the contemporary United States to like the late Roman Empire, in particular the late Western Roman Empire. Now it's on the verge of fall, and I don't think that's the case. And I'm never really sure what to think of it. If I had to place the United States on somewhere the timeline of Rome, I think I would have to say it's more like in the Gracchi period, where it's a lot of sort of, street populism in our politics, which eventually leads to the rise of dictatorships, more formal dictatorships.
If America's the Roman Empire, then New York City would be Rome itself, and Madison Square Garden would be the Colosseum.
Yeah, I mean, so it's pretty good. I mean, with all of it going on lately, with the whole Christian bashing, it's pretty good with how so it's really is. I could imagine it being like Rome, where they're actually, really hating the Christians just like them. Oh, and by the way, have you heard about how the Easter worshippers got killed in the bombing in Sri Lanka? I mean, I didn't hear about Easter worshippers before then. I mean, they must be a relatively new cult.
Well, they've been called that for some time, apparently.
Yeah. Well, you have your Easter worshippers, your cow avoiders, your dang it, what did that Babylon Bee article call Muslims?
Yeah. Sounds like something China would call them, Easter worshippers.
Yeah, I don't think they're coming up with new names for Christians. They're too busy trying to deal with the Dalai Lama, forbidding him from reincarnating outside China.
Oh yeah, that's funny. It's like, I mean, don't they just?
Brass, your speaker.
Oh, this better.
Yeah.
I remember what was actually pretty funny is like, I remember a lot of people were getting on the church. I mean, not the church, the prison for not letting this Buddhist be able to have his own chaplain in prison, even though he was a murderer and he's on death row. And like, well, I mean, they said, and they rushed into it, and they said, I mean, actually, no, they are taking their time with it. That's the thing. And they were asking, why is it taking so long for them to get a chaplain for him? And I said, well, they figure if he dies during the process, I mean, he can just come back later, reincarnated. It's a waiting game, sure, but still, you get there eventually.
Yeah, well, that's what happens when your religion has a restart function.
Basically.
Yeah, it's pretty good. And with that sort of thing, is like, is there any more like comments in the thread?
Let's see. Oh, one of them asked the thoughts on Easter worshippers. And that's about it for now. So, yeah, we should be wrapping up now. Tell our viewers where we can find you and if there's any projects you're working on.
Well, of course, yep, they can find me, of course, on the YouTube channel itself, youtube.com/Grant Hurst. That's, of course, the channel name Casual Historian. I'm also on Twitter at Grant G. Hurst. And the other project I'm working on, aside from videos, which there should be a new one out on Monday, is I also have a podcast called History of the Modern Middle East. It's a narrative history podcast about the history of the modern Middle East, starting from about 1900 going up to the present whenever I get there.
It seems how little has changed in 1,500 years.
Yep. Right, that's about all I have to say. What about you guys?
Yeah, I'm pretty good. You, Engine?
Not really. Anyway, this has been HistoryNet and Mr. Brass signing off now. See you next time. Whenever we'll try to be doing this once a week. So yeah, good night, everybody.